Welcome to the Teacher Seminar on question number 12 of our study guide for Unit 10. Question number 12 is Minnesota After the Crash, the Job Crisis. So we're going to read a couple pages in our study guide here and then go over and answer the questions, what is welfare and who was providing it in Minnesota? Explain why the job crisis in Minnesota was worse for African Americans and American Indians, and what percentage of the workforce did women account for in the 1930s, and who and why did many of them lose their jobs in the Great Depression? All right, so let's get into it. After the crash, the job crisis. Back in the city, Carl Warmington got a rude surprise. In the fall of 1930, a year after the crash, he had just finished his summer orchestra gig at the Breezy Point Lodge and was looking for a new job, but he could not find one. Not in Minneapolis, not anywhere. The economic crisis triggered by the stock market crash, the Great Depression, was spreading quickly through Minnesota and the rest of the nation. By the fall of 1930, private organizations such as the Salvation Army were struggling to provide welfare to a growing population of people without jobs and homes. Warmington thought his college degree could help him find a job, even in tough times. He was wrong. I looked in vain for any kind of full-time position, he recalled. I watched the want ads and filled out employment applications without a callback. Even though he had no job, Warmington still felt luckier than many people, since he had a place to live and parents. All right, so guys, welfare, as it says here on the screen, is aid in the form of money or necessities for people experiencing financial hardship. Now, today, welfare is provided for unemployed people by our government, but during this time, it was provided by private organizations such as the Salvation Army. Okay, all right. One day in December of 1930, he visited his friend's father. The man worked for a private organization that gave vouchers or tickets for meals and lodging to homeless men in Minneapolis. Years later, he described his impressions of what he called the soup line, where people could turn in a voucher to get a hot meal. What a dark and dreary sight. It had begun to snow, and the wind was howling down this deserted lane. Stretched across the side of an empty building was a long line of shivering men, many with only light jackets. The line reached down the alley to the fire escape and crawled up the side of the dark warehouse to the second floor. The only action from this long queue of men was from their stomping feet in the snow. Few jobs and many people. Among the men and women who struggled were those who worked on farms, mined the Iron Range, log forests, laborers in factories, or worked in offices. Now, some who built up Minnesota's industries were jobless and waiting in line for a chance to eat a hot meal or to sleep in a warm bed. Skilled workers fared better than unskilled workers, but people in every industry were hit hard. So what's that saying, guys, is if you were able to do a particular skill, like say you knew how you were a plumber, you were a carpenter, so you knew how to do a particular skill that not everybody had, you probably had a better time getting a job. Frequently, African American and American Indians were the first to be laid off and the last hired during these economic times. Frequently, African Americans and American Indians were the first to be laid off and the last hired during these tough economic times. There's the answer to question number 2. Nearly half of the African Americans in Minnesota by 1920 had been born in the South. Many had come to North to escape discrimination and seek new opportunities. Although most found the situation in Minnesota an improvement, few were treated as equals by European Americans. For many American Indians in Minnesota, the majority of whom lived on reservations, the Great Depression was a continuation of the hard times they had experienced for decades. During this time, men were generally considered breadwinners or economic providers for families. Women, who made up over 20% of the American workforce in 1930, often lost their jobs in favor of keeping men employed. Most women were married, and most of their husbands were still employed, but their wages had been cut dramatically. Other than Others had husbands who had just lost their jobs altogether. Just as men did, women struggled to provide for themselves and their families during this economic crisis. So there's your answer to that last question. Women made up about 20% of the job force. And because men were still seen as the primary breadwinners, oftentimes women were fired so that a man could keep his job. A few years into the crisis, the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote a book titled It's Up to Women. It's Up to the Women. In it, Eleanor Roosevelt offered these words of praise and encouragement to women. The needs of life must be met, and it's women's courage and determination which, time and again, have pulled us through worse crises than the present one. A job for Carl Warmington. In early 1931, Carl Warmington finally landed an office job with the city of Minneapolis. Before long, he was transferred to the city's Department of Public Relief, the agency that helped people who needed housing, food, counseling, health care, and clothing. By this time, about 35,000 people in a workforce of 212,000 people, 1 in 6 had lost their jobs in Minneapolis. So in Minneapolis, 1 in 6 people had lost their jobs. Nationally, it was closer to 1 in 4 people losing their jobs. So it was bad in Minneapolis, but not quite as bad as it was in some other places. So I hope this helps you answer the questions in number 12, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.